This is Counter-Argument, a Middle East podcast from the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. Since April 2023, Sudan has been a state of conflict driven by a power struggle between two rival military factions that has devastated the country. Over 3 million people were displaced just in the first 100 days, thousands killed, and many more wounded. But what do we actually know about the conflict in Sudan? In this episode of Counter-Argument, I speak with Anna Simone Reumert, a postdoctoral fellow at the Zolberg Institute for Migration and Mobility at the New School in New York City, who has conducted extensive ethnographic work with Sudanese migrant workers in Lebanon and Sudan. In our conversation, we touched on a wide variety of topics, from a basic understanding of the various local and global actors to why Anna insists we not call the conflict a civil war, along with an assessment of available diplomatic solutions. My name is Naghmeh Sohrabi. We are the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, and this is Counter-Argument. So let's jump right in. Welcome, Anna. I think it'll be safe to say that a lot of people know very little about Sudan. A lot of people are not following the news and what is going on. And it's understandable on some level, right? I'll just be honest and say that I was surprised that it's Africa's third largest country land-wise. And yet it seems for such a big space, it doesn't seem to hold our attention the way it should, the way Ukraine has, or even Syria to some extent. So can you, in a nutshell, basically tell us why should we care about what is going on right now in Sudan?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, we're talking about, over 3 million people have been displaced. I mean, from Middle East studies perspective, Syria has been the biggest refugee crisis that we think of other than Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
Almost 7 million people were displaced from Syria, according to official numbers and UN numbers. And of course, we know how EU reacted to that and the consequences politically of that. But that was in the span of 10 years. So 7 million people in the span of 10 years versus 3 million people in the span of 4 months.
Yeah.
This is perhaps also why the world is watching Sudan, because of the rapid speed of displacement that we're watching, and the rapid speed of destruction is almost unparalleled. Although people call it a civil war, this term can be quite misleading because it is a transnational war. And funny enough, when you mentioned Ukraine, Russia is one of the forces that are supporting one side of the war. The now notorious Wagner Group has been supplying the rapid support forces with missiles. That's not the only transnational force involved. We saw the Egyptian army very much under Sudanese armed forces since day one or day zero even of the fighting. Saudi Arabia and the US are organizing peace talks, which so far have failed to agree on a ceasefire. The United Arab Emirates have long been some form of allyship with the rapid support forces, and I could go on. There are a lot of regional actors involved as well on both sides and trying now to negotiate some kind of humanitarian safe passage.
What is the motivation for all these different groups to be involved in Sudan?
Okay, so if we divide it up to regional and somehow transnational or transregional, so Egypt has had a long contested sibling relationship and colonial relationship with Sudan. It colonized Sudan once. It is a neighboring country. It shares a large border, and it is also the country that has received the most of the displaced now. The far majority have gone to Egypt, actually, and with various degrees of success, let's say. There are horror stories from the border of forms of extraction and exploitation of people trying to get across. But that was myself in Cairo in May, actually, and I also saw a lot of solidarity expressed from the Egyptian people towards the Sudanese situation. And there's a very clear position from the Egyptian regime towards supporting the Sudanese armed forces and Burhan. And one can imagine that how Sisi would like to see Burhan cast Sudan in the image of Egypt, a sort of strict authoritarian but open economy vision, which is very much also Burhan's, or what people presume to be Burhan's vision for Sudan. Then you have also the fact that Sudan is a very rich resource land, right? It has gold, it has gum arabic, it has oil, mostly from South Sudan, it has 2 Niles. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf have been buying up land mostly for exporting ground meat and agrarian produce. And also gold is one of the biggest exports from Sudan. So there's a lot of interest in the various natural resources in Sudan, as well as the fact that it is bordering so many countries in the Horn of Africa, right? So it's both leading up to the Middle East. It has a maritime border crossing over to Jeddah from Port Sudan. It has the border to Egypt in the north. Then to the west, you have Chad. To the south, you have South Sudan and Eritrea and Ethiopia, as well as also crossing into Libya. And this is also why it's long been a transit zone for migration.
I remember with the Lebanese Civil War, one of the most confusing things about the Lebanese Civil War, both when you were living through it, but also teaching it afterwards, was trying to keep track of all the various groups and all the acronyms that went with the various groups. And listening to you talk, it was a flashback to the SLA, all these different groups. So I want to step back, both for myself and also for our listeners, to get a better sense of what the various actors are before we go further into this conversation. So, who are the local actors? And are they connected to a particular part of Sudan?
The Sudanese Armed Forces is the official army of the country. Historically, and under Omar Bashir's regime, which lasted through the 90s and up until 2019, when he was overruled by a peaceful civilian led revolution, they are mostly allied with what we can call the riverine elite, so people and tribes living along the River Nile. However, this is an internally very diverse group, which includes Islamists, army people who are not Islamists, cultural elite intellectuals, and so on. So when I say the riverine elite, it's not all people who are backing the army. And the army created the rapid support forces. So they created this beast that is now trying to overthrow them. It's a sort of Shakespearean horror of a daddy and son, but with great cost for the Sudanese people. So not like a theater.
And who are the Rapid Support Forces?
The Rapid Support Forces is the formation of different Arabized tribes in Darfur who fought previously under the name of Janjaweed, the devil on a horseback, under Bashir. So it was Bashir's paramilitary group. And the escalation of fighting and the turning against their daddy army happened over time during the transition of power since 2019, since the revolution, when there was an appointed technocratic government under previous Prime Minister Hamdok, who was power sharing with the military. There was a dispute and a disagreement over how to incorporate the RSF back into the army. The RSF was sort of becoming an octopus and a beast unto itself. And so it became the army's nightmare, or certainly Burhan's nightmare. But I kind of think of the RSF as the Luban proletariat because they can be purchased for any political goal, and they have become the nouveau riche from looting. But historically, they are from a marginalized place in Darfur. And there is that element to it. There is this class and geographical division between the army and the RSF that RSF has articulated. One officer said at the beginning of the war, we want to rest like they do in the city. In the city, they always sleep out in the bush, meaning in Western Sudan. In Darfur, we are never sleeping. We're always fighting. We're always working. We're always hustling. So there is this class jealousy of the city, of the capital, and of the satellite cities along the Nile, which is now coming to the fore. And this class division is much larger than these two groups, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. It is Sudan's class division between the agrarian peripheries and the River Nile cities.
So is the US interest in Sudan a mediated interest? Is it interested because its allies in the region are interested? Or, for example, is it interested because of Libya, in which it had an actually direct presence?
There is a concern, an international concern, this war could escalate into regional fighting. And so the US is always, quote unquote, concerned about keeping stability in the Horn of Africa and keeping stability in Sudan because of its location between the Middle East and East Africa. There are some allegations about that gum arabic is needed for Coca-Cola production. I'm not sure how important that part is, but it might be.
Oh, come on, Coca-Cola is important.
Yes, Coca-Cola is important for sure. And so there are many different scales of interest in Sudan. The question over who US supports right now is, I think from both US and EU, there is a press preference for the Sudanese armed forces over the rapid support forces, but with the aim of transitioning into the civilian democratic rule, which was the plan that was stalled when the military couped the technocratically appointed government in 2021. But many also worry that, for example, because there's so much displacement from Sudan, that the European Union, which is always concerned about keeping its borders closed, will sort of ally with anyone who can promise to curb migration, which was already why the EU had some kind of working relationship with the previous regime under Omar Bashir, who did rein in migration with very little success and a lot of human costs. So, right now, actually, the most interesting or promising plan for diplomatic intervention is from the neighboring countries led by Kenya, but also involving South Sudan, Ethiopia, who are also receiving a lot of the displaced people from Sudan, as well as Djibouti. They have actually articulated plans recently to intervene militarily in order to assure a safe passage of humanitarian aid, which has been stalled so far, as well as to keep a lasting ceasefire. Burhan, who is leading the Sudanese armed forces, has rejected their initiative so far, claiming that especially Kenya is leaning towards rapid support forces. So there is a lot of allegations and accusations and mistrust, but the real fact that we can see is that both parts are not interested in compromising their gain for power and that they both are fighting to win or die.
Just if I wanted to kind of push back, at the earlier part of the conversation, you said, here's why this is not a civil war. But I feel like you just, in telling us who the various players are, who the Sudanese armed forces are, who the RSF are, made an argument for the fact that this is a civil war, that this is internal, two groups of people having maybe class conflict, maybe the conflicts that go into geographical differences, but it does sound like it's a civil war. So why do you resist the word civil war when it sounds like the main actors are local, are getting help from regional actors, no doubt, but they are fighting internally?
I mean, the UN recently declared it a civil war, and it's the same is happening again now in media and policy analysis over and over. We can say it's a civil war, but as long as we just remember that Sudan has always been a place of transnational interests, and that transnational interests are fueling the fire right now, right? From the different sites that I mentioned, and that there's also a lot of diplomatic muscle work going on right now for the same reason. Everyone wants to now rescue Sudan. And yes, the two main actors are local. The people who are peacefully resisting the regime are also local. But the reason I'm mentioning this class and geographical division, which of course is very much a Sudanese question, is because political economy is so central to this story. So there is the historical division, right, of city and periphery. There is the fact that the agrarian countryside and really the side of production has been marginalized, whereas the side of consumption has been privileged by previous political powers. And we see that coming to the fore now. But that is part of a transnational story because Sudan has, since the time of Ottoman slavery, and certainly under colonial rule, and also since the 80s, with the Gulf becoming interested in investing in Sudan, it is a place of extraction. It is a place where you can extract cheap labor and cheap produce. And so the class division internally is also transnationally fueled. I mean, that's how global capitalism works, but we just see it so clearly here.
Would it be fair to say that from your perspective, the lack of attention being shown to the situation that is having a massive, massive destructive impact in terms of lives and everything else that we'll get into, that calling it a civil war is part of the reason why what is happening in Sudan is being marginalized?
Yeah, either marginalized or that the vision for how to solve it is narrowed to the familiar repertoire of diplomatic solutions that we have seen not helping in places like Syria. So, yeah, I mean, the problem with the term civil war in this context is that it can become self explanatory and it can sort of risk feeding into old colonial misconceptions of tribal ethnic differences as being the cause and effect of any conflict and also the solution to conflict, rather than seeing the structural and economic violence that has been going on for decades and leading to disputes over land, resources, and power.
Yeah, but when you have a war raging
Of
on,
course, of course, you can never solve the question of capital in times of crisis. And in times when there's not crisis, the question is rarely dealt with. But it's also the case that in times of crisis, and aside from its political transformation in the past couple of years, it's also been in a severe economic crisis with people standing in bread lines, lack of fuel, so much that even public transportation was stalled for weeks at a time in the capital and so on during different moments that I've been there and witnessed this. So it's interesting to think about also that it is exactly a time where these questions should be addressed, but they're not being addressed.
when you were talking about how we got to basically the war that we're in right now, that started on April 15th, I was thinking about the fact that, and I'm sure our listeners remember all of this, that for the longest time, the word Darfur,
Right.
it was synonymous with a lot of death, a lot of destruction. Like people knew that something was going on in Sudan. Maybe they didn't know Darfur was in Sudan, but Darfur became synonymous with that. And it made me wonder if you could take us through a sense of not a history from the colonial times, but just a little bit of more background to the point in which the current war started. How far back would you go for this narrative? And what was the role of 2019 in all of this?
Right. Okay. So the war didn't start in Darfur, but Darfur has definitely become the scene of war crimes at a greater scale than any other region since the war started. And this is an all too familiar scenario in the history of Sudan, where Darfur has been the place of extraction for the slave market, the place of extreme regime violence and brutality, especially under Omar Bashir's regime. And I mentioned the Janjaweed, which became sort of a haunting force there. Most recently, the Darfur governor and former rebel leader Minawi, he's called Mini Minawi, or referred to as such, called for people to pick up arms to self-defend in Darfur against what appears to be an all-out war against the local tribes as well as the traditional monarchical form of power that was kind of ruling in Darfur. But on a national scale, when the power sharing government was elected in August 2019, what was a compromised agreement since the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF had already lost all legitimacy in the eyes of the people who had led the revolution since they massacred a large number of protesters on June 3rd in 2019. That's important to remember. So that was what led up to this compromised agreement between the Forces for Freedom of Change and the military in August, and they elected Hamdok.
Mhm.
But what is important to remember is that Hamdok was driven by a different vision, let's say, than the protesters who had put front and center a question of economic justice, right?
Yeah.
So they did not see eye to eye on that question, and there were tensions of socioeconomic justice as well as political representation that was growing during what was otherwise seen as, certainly in hindsight, as the years of promise, or at least where there was a horizon of change still from 2019 until the coup in October 25th, 2021. And the protests continued over the rise in prices and cost of living alongside what seemed like an infrastructural deadlock. Nobody was picking up trash. I remember having that observation when I was there, you know. That's always what happens, of course, when there's a transformation of power or a transition of power. Who does the most basic things that allows a city to sustain itself?
That's kind of also is another point that reminded me of Lebanon, of course.
Yeah, and I was going to say, interestingly enough, in Lebanon, trash collection is a very lucrative market. So everyone is very interested in that, but that's a whole nother Pandora's box. So I think it's important to remember that it wasn't all rosy, although the time following the revolution and the power sharing agreement was full of cultural promise and so much was happening. I was there in 2020 until the COVID pandemic hit, and there was like every night a theater festival, film festival, street parties, musicians were performing everywhere, you know. couples were holding hands on Tutti Island, watching the sunset, all of these things that had been banned during the 30-year authoritarian rule. So there really was a sense of change and a sense of promise and an optimism in the air that was then curbed first by the lack of economic change that people were seeing, and then reversed by the coup in 2021, which then rejuvenated protests.
I know that in our conversations, when you had raised the question of why diplomacy keeps failing, one of the things that you talked about is that a lot of the diplomatic solutions that are being put forth are looking at the problem as a purely politics and purely power sharing problem. So, can you get into that a little bit and specifically talk about the neighborhood resistance committees and how they have to be part of any kind of diplomatic solution, in your opinion?
Yeah, so the neighborhood resistance committees is sort of the big, often unmentioned player, not in the conflict, but in Sudanese politics. They emerged as a sort of organic infrastructure of social mobilization, all volunteer based, all neighborhood based, which also means there's not one committee, but there are many, many committees. And while they agree on the fundamental ideals of, no to weapons, no to like any military rule, they're quite diverse. You have college graduates and people from sort of Khartoum intellectual families, as well as people who have come from villages who have joined the struggle, right? But the way that they organize is a little bit similar to this more traditional form of social mobilization in Sudan called Narfir, which is also a form of care work. And you see that very much happening now in Khartoum, where, a third of the city has been displaced. And because humanitarian organizations have not been able to enter, it is the resistance committees who are the only ones who are able to enter many areas with food and medical aid, and also because hospitals have been held hostage, by both parties to the fight. From a diplomatic perspective, the problem with the resistance committees is that they're not a political party. They don't have an elected representative who can speak on behalf of their constituency. And so they're not considered a viable partner in negotiations for Sudan's future, nor do they want to sit at the table, because that's not how they organize. They're not organized as an elected representative of voices on the ground, but they are the voices on the ground. And that's the problems, right? Like, you cannot invite the revolutionary resistance committees for a lunch to sort of fix or iron out disagreements in Sudan, because that's not how they operate. And that is a challenge for the diplomatic, let's say, visions or strategies for Sudan.
It seems to me then you just drew a pretty, I would say, in some ways, grim picture where you're basically saying the solution is this group of people, right? The neighborhood resistance committees. But the neighborhood resistance committees don't want to sit at the table, and no one is asking them to sit at the table.
What I do know from the people I know who are very active in this resistance committees is that they cannot sit at this table if the table must include the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF, both of which have killed and maimed and detained the resistance committees systematically since the revolution began, and much before that, because of course there's been at least a decade of youth-based social organizing and political mobilization before the revolution broke out at the end of 2018.
How do you solve this conundrum, for lack of a better word?
So, yes, this is certainly a conundrum if we want to stick to a sort of diplomatic vocabulary. But there are other forms of thinking about Sudan. I mean, I don't have a solution sort of laid out, but I think whatever solution people prescribe, it will not be successful if the neighborhood resistance committees, which again is a lot of people and a lot of young people, so we're talking about people in their 20s and 30s, if they cannot identify with whatever becomes the representation of the political power in Sudan, it will not go well. There will continue to be very important disagreements over basic questions of, like, how do I get my food? Who gets what? Who gets to decide what I can do and not do? Questions of civil rights, questions of economic justice, gender justice. Certainly, one would hope that it would be in the interests from an ideological perspective of places like the EU and the US to support their ideal for Sudan. However, we have yet to see whether that will happen. And again, this war, while it is transnational, the solution has to be led by different Sudanese people, right? It cannot be led internationally. So, if any diplomatic solution can sort of keep front and center the question of the economy and the question of how to protect this country's resources from any form of extraction, whether local or transnational, I think it will have more success than an agreement that only talks about who sits in the office and not sort of who distributes the goods. You mentioned the Lebanese Civil War, which was solved, quote unquote, internationally or regionally. And we all saw how that went.
I think the Lebanese case, as you rightly say, shows that you can stop the immediate destruction and bloodshed, but then the solution can just prolong. It's like the country is just bleeding out,
right,
versus gushing blood. And, I think that's the kind of scenario that you're making me think about.
Yeah, because people start to profit from the conflict.
Yeah.
I mean, that was certainly what happened in Lebanon, right? There was a considerable war economy in Lebanon that grew with the fighting, where each militia had a stake in keeping the fighting. What we see in Sudan that's really different from Lebanon, but not different from Syria, is that one group, one party, the RSF, is systematically destroying culture, right? So they've been looting and destroying cultural heritage. The university campuses in the city have been destroyed. Archives. I know the academics listening and the historians listening will be very sad to hear that the biggest archive of Sudanese studies is destroyed. And many of my friends are talking about the city as gone. This is not really what happened in Lebanon. But with ISIS, that actually happened in Syria, right? I'm not saying that the RSF are the only one destroying, because you have, on the other hand, the Air Force of the army destroying the environment. Airstrikes have destroyed the soil, and mentioned the significance of agrarian production to Sudan, both for its subsistence and for its export. We don't even know the consequences of that yet, but we know that the soil has at least been destroyed for this year's harvest.
Which would only exacerbate
Yes,
the issues that already existed, right? In terms of starvation and access to just basic food supplies.
exactly. Drought along with flooding have always occurred in Sudan seasonally, but have escalated and exacerbated with climate change, and has worsened the agrarian production, and so has led to starvation and hunger, as well as destruction of houses with the flooding, both in Western Sudan, but also in places like Jazeera. And so the airstrikes, destruction of soil, on top of this already ongoing climate induced destruction, it's a nightmare. I don't know the consequences yet, but I know that it means that many people are losing their livelihood. And these are the people who have nowhere to go.
And can't leave, right?
Exactly. Even in the displacement of Sudan, there is a class difference between the people who could go to Egypt, which became quickly the most expensive route. The people who went to Chad were mostly coming from Darfur. It's also the closest way to go from Darfur. You go west, you go to Chad. People who go to South Sudan, mostly also from agrarian communities in Jazeera, they would go to South Sudan and Ethiopia. And of course, if people who had a foreign passport probably went further away. But Egypt and South Sudan have taken the vast majority of the displaced, and Chad as well, actually. And those three countries, I think, places a very different and class opportunities for people arriving.
I was just curious for our listeners if you could tell us what your intellectual path was to working on Sudan and becoming such a wonderful commentator on it.
So I was working in Lebanon as a researcher and also as a volunteer with anti-racist communities that involved migrants from Africa and South Asia. And then while I was conducting that research, Sudan was changing and Lebanon was changing rapidly. Both countries were undergoing revolutions, or that word was at least used for both in 2019, with different results. Lebanon was stalled, whereas Sudan did have a transition of power for a while. So, what was happening as Lebanon was deteriorating and collapsing, both from the explosion and the economy, was that many migrants were losing their jobs or the value of their income. And so many chose to return to Sudan in 2020. And they led this mass sit in across the city that lasted like 8 months.
Across Beirut, right?
Across Beirut, yes. A spectacular example of migrant political action where different migrant groups were organizing in front of the embassies, calling for their right of return. And I volunteered for the Sudanese fundraising for repatriation and then decided to follow them back. So I went with some migrants back to Sudan.
Was this the first time you went to Sudan?
I had already been to Sudan in 2018, and then this was in 2020 and 21, and again this winter. I saw how migration was changing as Sudan was changing. And of course, the more time I spent in Sudan, the more people I met who were involved with the revolution there and who were not themselves migrants and who had a different stake, perhaps, in the country's future than people who had migrated with the plan of returning, but who found themselves absent as things were happening on the ground, right? They were watching the revolution from TVs or from social media while being in Lebanon that was going through its own horror and its own changes. And they were feeling sort of alienated from both. So being in Sudan enabled me to look at migration from different sides. But then I also just became very much in solidarity with the Sudanese revolution and just learned a lot about social mobilization and mutual aid and survival, really, from the friends I made in Sudan.
Thank you so much for sharing this very deep and nuanced way of thinking about what's going on in Sudan and upending a lot of our assumptions. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much, Naghmeh. It was really interesting. You kept me on the edge of my seat.
You've been listening to Counter Argument, a Middle East podcast from the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. Please join us next time for more insights into the region's politics, history, society, and economics.